Hey there.
How are you?
Good. How are y'all doing?
Okay, our cat has decided to join the class as soon as we hit the Zoom button. She decided she wanted to be on camera.
I love it. Of course she did. She's
So Cindy
pretty.
is telling me that you guys just moved to South Haven. Is that right?
We did. It's still hard for us to say those words, but we love it.
Good. She mentioned something about a house on a lake,
Yes.
which I assume that will be nice once the weather starts turning a little bit and you can enjoy that outdoor space, right?
Yeah, we've been here almost a year,
Oh,
and
okay.
yeah, even now, I mean, it's so nice. We go out there now. We have kind of a great space for wintertime outside and a great space for spring and summer. So that's the main reason we moved here.
We we have been enjoying our outdoor space too for the same reasons, right? We don't have much other than a covering. We don't have certainly don't have a lake,
Yeah.
but we have covered space and we have heat and we have a fireplace
Yes.
and we have fans for when it's warm. So, it's great right now. It's all you
Right.
can ask for. Makes people feel comfortable anyway and feel like they can still be around and
Yes.
feel somewhat normal. So
We were able to get a couple of heaters before they were all gobbled up. So that has definitely helped. And we got a new fire pit. And if people are still cold, we give them an electric blanket.
Good idea.
sometimes that's a little better than anything, honestly. You can wrap up an electric blanket. You don't need that other stuff, honestly, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So, oh, I hear purring now.
I was wondering if it was getting picked up on the microphone.
We had to put our cat down last week. It was Frank's cat. It came with a marriage. I'm the dog person. He's the cat person. But it's amazing how I've gotten used to her also.
Yeah.
You got used to, hey, Emily, how are you? I'm still not used to the cats. This is our second. So I inherited one when we got married, who was very young at that point. And then this is our second cat, and I'm still not accustomed to that. So,
He likes to deny it, but he loves her.
I feel you. I feel you.
Jenna, your hair looks beautiful.
Really? I was just thinking about
yes.
Thank you.
Take it from me.
Emily, we may have, the word may have filtered out. I don't know. We may have ordination installation tomorrow afternoon at 5:30. Reinstallation or reinstallation, I guess, for you, right? Because you're upping for another year. Is that right? As a deacon?
Are we going to be able to get people to
outdoors in the parking lot is the tentative plan, but I think Anne is thinking about it, working on it. So we'll see what happens.
Is it too short notice though? I haven't heard anything about it.
Can you do it tomorrow at 5:30 potentially?
Hey, Cindy.
Hey, Cindy.
Hey. Well, Jeremy, I don't know.
I'll tell you what, it might rain us out anyway, I think has been part of the hesitation for planning that fully. So it's supposed to rain all day tomorrow. I'm not sure it's going to happen, but we'll see. Just planting the seed, Emily, just in case. Not sure it's going to happen.
We don't spontaneously ordain people, Jeremy.
We do in a pandemic.
Good Lord.
You got that right.
All right. So, Angela, does it tell you if you've got the ability to share your screen?
I think I can. Let's
Very
see.
good. Okay. So Angela's going to be leading us tonight. Y'all probably know her already, but she is the executive director at the Baptist Centers for Good Grief. And she will be talking about grief in the midst of a pandemic and all that we are dealing with as it relates to that. Jeremy, can you open us in prayer?
I can. Let's pray, y'all. Holy God, we are thankful tonight for each other's presence. We confess, though, Lord, that we're tired. We are physically tired. We're mentally tired. We are worn out from all these things that we've been dealing with, all this grief, all this sadness, all this lack of normalcy. God, please be present with us tonight. Let us have just one normal moment with each other, talking about all these things. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.
Okay, you ready for me? Okay. Well, thank you all for being here tonight to talk about grief and parenting in the midst of a pandemic and other losses. I know it's late, and I think that prayer was perfect because I know everyone is tired, not just physically tired at the end of a weekend, but mentally and emotionally as well. And I also just have to acknowledge that this is a heavy topic. Loss is a heavy topic. And we're here for an hour, so it's time limited. You don't have to listen to me forever. I do try to use humor as appropriate, but I think it's just important to kind of acknowledge that kind of where we're going for the next few minutes is heavy, based on wherever each person is in their own lives, with loss, and then kind of this global loss that we're all experiencing with the pandemic. And then the loss that we all experience being, part of the community of Idlewild, because there's certainly been so much loss and so much pain there. So that's a lot. Even just saying that before I even go any further, you may start to feel a heaviness and an overwhelmedness. And I just want to acknowledge that. That this is a safe space. I certainly have slides prepared to kind of help keep me on track, but I would like you to feel comfortable interrupting me and asking questions as we go. Please feel free to do that. I want this to be what each of you need tonight. So just want to acknowledge the heaviness. We'll acknowledge it again at the end as we go into this. At the Center for Good Grief, where I work, this is something we say to our parents all the time as we kind of launch into parenting and grieving, that if you take the grief out, 90% of parenting is thinking about, when can I go lay down? When can I get sleep, right? It's the thing that has been taken away as you launched into parenting. And so look at that, like 90%, that's before grief, that's before a pandemic. So Jeremy, again, your prayer was totally appropriate and totally right on. You're tired. You are tired as parents on a normal day, whatever that is, whatever that looks like. So before we get into kind of specifics with the pandemic and other losses, I just think we have to start with what is grief. Grief to a lot of people means, oh, I think that's sadness, right? It's when you're sad or when you cry. And grief is so much more than that. I love this quote that grieving is a whole body experience. It's like wearing tight shoes. So if you've ever worn tight shoes to an event, you reacted in 5 different ways while you had those tight shoes on. You had a physical reaction, cognitive, spiritual, emotional, and behavioral. And that's how we all grieve. That's how children grieve. That's how adults grieve 5 different ways. So your body has a grief response. Your mind has grief responses. Spiritually, you have questions or maybe strengthened thoughts and feelings. You have emotional responses. That's the one everybody usually knows, sadness, but it's more than that. Rage, confusion. That's one that we're certainly hearing a lot right now, especially from children, just confusion. Why do so many things keep happening? Okay. And then behavioral responses. You're probably seeing that within your homes with your children and even yourself, how you're responding to all of the different losses. So when you think about how am I grieving or how is my child grieving, it's really those 5 different ways that you kind of have to go through and assess and ask yourself questions from each of those reactions. So a lot of times people will talk about the stages of grief and they'll say, oh, I think I'm in the bargaining stage right now. But then if they get angry again, they'll say, oh, I can't even grieve right. I'm grieving wrong. The stages of grief are really something that I just wish people would kind of put out of their mind. That was not written and meant to be steps in a recipe for the grieving person. Those stages of grief are really what a person who is actively dying really goes through and experiences. For those of us that are grieving losses, whether that be someone we love or a job, the pandemic, I like to look at grief more like the ocean. I love the water. I'm a water person. And if you all could just sort of think about standing in front of the ocean with me for a moment, think about, as when you look out at the ocean, for as far as you can see is water. So you can't see where that ocean ends. You can't see that ending point. And for a lot of losses that we grieve, there's really no ending point. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to have these intense reactions. Remember the 5 different ways we grieve I just went through. It doesn't mean that you're going to have all of those intense reactions forever. It's just that grief is the result of love, and love doesn't end. Therefore, grief doesn't have an ending point. The other thing that I like about kind of thinking about grief like the ocean is in the ocean, there are waves, and grief impacts us through waves. If we were all standing in front of the ocean right now, we would see the waves, and there would probably be a lot that, we saw them coming, but we would be able to keep talking. There might be some other waves might come in a little stronger, and I may have to say, oh, y'all, hang on a second. I got to think about kind of how I'm standing here. Let me get my footing, so I'm okay. And we have to think through some waves of grief. But then there are those other waves that sometimes we don't see coming, or I see it and I think, oh, I'm fine. I'm going to keep talking right now, but it can knock me over. And if you've been knocked over by a wave, you know what that's like, that intensity. I can only hold my breath so long. How do I stand up? Where's the bottom? Is there another wave behind it? So you might be able to hear some fear in that. And so the waves of grief can bring about moments of, I got this, and moments of real intense fear. And so a lot of times we see the wave that we see that I say, oh, hang on a minute, I got to stop talking. Let me think about how I'm going to stand. Those are more predictable things. For a lot of folks that we work with at the Centers for Good Grief, we just went through a lot of the waves that people saw coming. The holidays, people know they're coming. They're on the calendar. They're going to happen. And so that's one that we really think through and we plan through. The waves that can knock you over that you don't expect are usually the little things, but those little things usually mean so much. So I'll give you an example from my life. After my brother died, I had a meeting one night and I had about 45 minutes. So there wasn't really anywhere to go. So I popped in TJ Maxx and I thought, oh, I'll walk around TJ Maxx for a while. So I'm walking around, I have my little cart, I found a couple of treasures. Well, all of a sudden over the music, which is no words, just the music, I heard a song. And it was a song that was very meaningful to me and my brother. And all those 5 reactions I told you, physically, cognitively, emotionally, spiritually, and behaviorally, were all happening to me. And I had to abandon cart and get out of the store. And that was that wave that I didn't see coming that just sort of took my breath away. knocked me over, and I had this intense grief reaction. So I think it's better for us if we think about grief being like the ocean, so that we can sort of have a moment of accepting that we are going to have intense, burst within that grief. Also, kind of before we get into tips for parenting while grieving, again, the language, what does all of this mean? So for us, for the work that I do, and my background and training is very specific to the death of a loved one. But again, at some point, loss is loss is loss is loss. So a divorce brings about loss. Okay. This pandemic has brought great loss. Natural disasters, things like that. So I'll try to speak more broadly than we do within our work, but within the Baptist Centers for Good Grief, we have free grief counseling for children, teens, and adults grieving the death of a loved one. So I start with the word bereaved. When someone you love has died and you are bereaved, if you look at what that word means, it means to be torn apart. To have experienced trauma, to be traumatized, like a lot of people from this year. Look at that. It's a wound. You've been pierced. And then grief, I think it's always important to acknowledge that grief is all of the thoughts and feelings that you have that are running around inside your head and your body after a loss. And I want you to sort of hear that, because again, you can hear kind of the physical part, the cognitive part, the emotional part, all of these thoughts and feelings that run around inside of you. So grief, a lot of times people say we're really a grief avoidant culture. We are, but that takes me to mourning. Mourning is the outward expression of grief. And so most people will say, well, how do I heal from this? And I'll usually say, yes, grieving is important, but how you mourn is going to tell you how you're going to heal. So I say that we're a grief avoidant culture, but we are very much a mourning avoidant culture. Our culture does not like the outward expression of grief. And that's one of the things that we see that grieving people struggle with, is because, well, who can I share this with? Nobody's really open to my outward expression of grief. So I just think that's a really important thing to clarify, that mourning is hard work. Mourning is all the verbs. It's all the things that we have to do to express our grief. And so you see, the last thing I have here is grief is a normal response. That's probably one of the biggest takeaways I ever want people to walk away with, is that grief is a normal response to a very abnormal event. Okay. So if I ended with one slide, I would say, okay, we'll end with this one, but we're going to get into a little bit more detail. But how to parent while grieving? Right here. Help yourself first. Read that again as parents. Help yourself first. Take care of your heart. Take care of your body. Rest. Have people to talk to. Come and attend, talks like this to kind of recharge your batteries. Because if you are taken care of, your little people can be taken care of. Okay? Express your grief. We try so hard to be the strong ones in our families and try not to show our feelings, but you need to express. Don't hide your emotions. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. Like, how do you do that and what does that look like? Seek out support for yourself. Know that you can't be the be all end all for your kids. Build up a support system around them. Idlewild is a great example of that. Have other people, other healthy, emotional people around your children to help provide support to them. Striving for a normal routine in a very abnormal time, but that is so critical for children and for how they will cope. You see discipline there. It's always a reminder that we need to keep up with whatever type of discipline you were normally doing before the loss occurred, meaning children need to know their limits. They need to know consequences. That helps them feel safe. Again, your self-care is critical, and being kind to yourself. This is hard. This is really hard. At the Centers for Good Grief, we're kind of big mantra people. And that's one that I find myself saying to myself when I start to like, what is going on? Why can't I do this? Or when I kind of start going down that negative road, this is hard. This is really hard for everyone. So let's get into just some tips, some just kind of breaking down kind of that list I just had into some kind of smaller bite-sized pieces. Number one, how to parent children through loss is to think about safety. Okay, so physical safety, yes. Spiritual safety, yes. Emotional safety, yes. Cognitive safety, yes. So when something happens, when a loss occurs, when there's been a traumatic event, our nervous system just is like ignited because that's its job, is to tell us that we're not safe. Well, that happens in the response to loss as well, especially for children. This has never occurred before. I am scared. The adults all around me are acting very different. That nervous system for that child, for the adults, it is just on fire. So one thing that we can do for children is asking them and telling them, and it looks like you don't feel very safe right now. And then here's the big key. I don't feel safe. I feel scared. It's okay to admit to kids that you feel scared. But you know what helps me calm down? It helps me when I can hold your hand. Can you hold my hand for a minute? Say that one, because a lot of times if you can physically connect with your child in those moments, that physical touch is a sense of grounding. It can help ground them in safety and help ground you in safety as well. Okay. So it's not just the physical safety, it's the emotional safety. But again, when we ground with each other through that holding of a hand, that helps with the emotional safety as well. And also ask yourself, kind of before a traumatic event, know yourself, know what helps you calm down, and do that when you are in a sad moment or a scary moment. Remember what helps ground you, and then model that behavior for your child. So that safety I'm talking about can be in the midst of something really traumatic, but also long term. So for what that means is we really can't do our grief work until we feel safe. Okay. So what that means is for a lot of people, grief work gets delayed. Maybe if it's a death, it might be the type of death. Pandemic is the perfect example of that as well. We don't know when this is going to end. And so there's little things we can do each day to cope. But in terms of really processing this pandemic, none of us are going to do that for a while. Okay, so I'm not trying to sound like a negative Nelly. We have coping skills that we need to initiate to help us. But in terms of truly being able to process this pandemic, we won't be able to do that as a society until we have that safety again. So a word about numbness. I love numbness. Another word for numbness is denial. Some people think, I guess I'm in denial and that's terrible. No, denial actually saves us quite a bit. Numbness saves us quite a bit. I put the word bandage there. I think it's kind of like if you were to have a wound. Your wound doesn't heal immediately. You bandage it, you give it time. And numbness allows us to do that. I really honestly believe that numb stage of grief really is a safety net for a lot of people because the feelings are too many and they're too overwhelming. It's important to acknowledge that when we have a loss, that it's more than just the one event. So if somebody we love dies, we lose the person we can see, touch, and feel, but we lose more than just that person we can see, touch, and feel. This pandemic has brought about many losses. So within loss, we look deeper at a loss of self, a loss of security, and a loss of meaning. So already, I hope you're not feeling too overwhelmed, but I hope this helps you see that grief is more than sad. And that it's really great that you're here tonight because your children are coping with a lot. You are coping with a lot. Whether it's you have 3 losses that you're dealing with, 1 loss, it's a lot. It's a lot. So look at that. The pandemic, if we want to use that one, it's changed a lot of our identities. Everything is different. We see fewer people. We do fewer things. I've talked with a lot of people about, dressing differently. I mean, that impacts your self-esteem, your personality. Like, I just feel like I'm being casual all the time. But also security. That's a big one for the pandemic. Are we ever going to feel safe again in our world? Working with kids that I work with, a lot of them, they're grieving the death of a loved one. And then we always also are talking about the loss from the pandemic. And I have a lot of kids saying, I'm scared. I'm scared that we're never going to be able to go anywhere without wearing a mask. And then a lot of them also say, I don't ever want to go anywhere without wearing a mask. So when you have children who are coping with multiple losses, you may see that heightened fear, okay? And they can't just verbally tell you that. Remember, children, frontal lobe, it's not all developed. They can't explain and process everything. But one of the biggest things for a child who is grieving is fear. What else might happen? Who else could get this virus? Are they going to die? So all of these losses that you see here in terms of self, security, and meaning, these might be things that are resonating with you. But again, these are the secondary losses that come after the main event, whether it's a death, a divorce, the pandemic. So how do we parent our children who are grieving losses? Well, one thing you have to know is you have to be educated on grief and on feelings. You have to check yourself for your feelings. And then I'm a big believer in honest, age-appropriate talks. We model behavior for our children all the time, right? Like, think about going to church. We have norms in our family about what kind of behavior we approve of at church. And when we get to go to church, we have conversations in the car about that. Please don't do this, or please do this. Remember your manners, all of these types of norms. Well, I think it would be really great if families could really bring grief into some of the norms in terms of modeling behavior, for parents to know it's okay to say you're sad. It's okay to say you're mad. It's okay to say I'm confused. Because the relief you give a child when you acknowledge a harder feeling and that you are having it, that gives them so much relief to know that they are okay, that they're normal, they're not crazy. Okay, my mom, my dad, who I look up to, who I respect, they feel that way. Okay, this might be okay. So again, we model so many things for our children and have so many norms. Really having discussions within the family about feelings and about grief can be really, really helpful. Having a routine, which is very hard during the pandemic. It's sort of a new routine, new normal. And sometimes it changes based on, what we can safely do in the community and what we cannot do. But having the routine at home, one thing that gives children the sense of safety within their homes is dinner time and bedtime. What are some things, some norms that you all can have that create a routine? Because when you do that, safety comes with that. One thing too that can be helpful is letting go of, maybe things that you have learned about grief and mourning. Maybe it was from your family. It may have been norms that you grew up with. Sometimes we have to retrain our own brains as adults One that I grew up with in my family was a lot about crying. You know, we don't cry. That crying is weak. Um, and that's one I definitely have had to retrain and relearn, because crying is a release. I mean, there's scientific evidence about what it does for our bodies. So, you know, also a lot of us grew up with, I need to be strong, I need to carry on, I need to carry on for the family, and I need to be strong. Well, yes, there's probably truth in that, but strength can also be talking about feelings and expressing feelings. Because one thing we have to remember about our children, they are going to grieve in their lifetime. They are. That's the one thing we know is true. Grief is the most universal experience there is. It crosses everything. No one can escape grief. And so, you know, think about how much energy we put into where our kids go to school and what we want for their futures. Well, helping them have healthy coping skills for grief is a huge thing that you can do for your children into their lives. So the pressure cooker phenomenon, I put an asterisk by it here because I do think this is something so appropriate to talk about with Idlewild in terms of being in a pandemic, but all of the other losses that have occurred at Idlewild, you know, from staff resigning and retiring to the many, many precious people of Idlewild who have died this year, to the new changes ahead with a new head of staff. That's all grief. So some of it is grief of losing the presence of people that we love and are used to seeing around Idlewild, grief from losing people through death, and then the pandemic on top of that. So with the pressure cooker phenomenon, that basically what that means is everyone has this high need, these are high needs of grief and needing to be understood, yet also everyone has a very low capacity for dealing with each other's grief and feelings. And so that's just something to be very mindful of, to be very aware of, is that everyone at Idlewild is grieving. And everyone has this need for talking and expression and understanding, but it may not be with some of the people that you would normally have thought that that's who you could go to, because again, everyone kind of has this low capacity. Some folks I've talked with at Idlewild really have had to find support outside of Idlewild because, one, we're in a pandemic and we're not getting to see each other face to face or in person, but also just because of that kind of low tolerance that everyone is experiencing because of so much grief. And I just think that's really important to acknowledge. Several people have said, well, what do we do? Well, I think we keep doing stuff like this. We keep talking in Sunday school classes and in small groups and leaning on each other. But I think you also just have to acknowledge that this is what it is. It's grief overload. And grief overload is very real. And we have to be patient with each other and kind of know that this is what the entire Idlewild community is experiencing. Something else that I think is important when you're parenting through pandemic and other losses as well is limiting media exposure or social media exposure. That can be very overwhelming for us as adults. And again, we have the whole frontal lobe ability to process and take in what we're hearing, but our little people don't. And I'm hearing this from the kids that I work with all the time. They're like, every time they turn the TV on, it's just death, death, death. More people are dying. Everyone's dying. Again, that fear response is kicking in for our kids, that I don't feel safe. And so that's just something that I think is very important. Also, it's okay to watch it if you kind of debrief it. Now, I don't mean you have to like sit down and have like a clinical debriefing, but make sure you're talking. talk about what is happening in the news in the community if you're going to watch it and have it on. Kind of say then at those moments, I feel very overwhelmed by hearing all of that. Come back to those feeling words, or what did you think about that? That makes me feel really sad. So if you're going to watch it or have that on, make sure you have that time for processing, but limiting is so important as well. I cannot stress enough about taking care of your body and your little people, them taking care of their body, getting out for even just a short walk, even on cold days, walk 3 mailboxes, but moving, getting some air. Because a lot of us with screens, we're sitting with our shoulders, our backs are hurting, we're not getting up and moving, we're not getting the fresh air. That is remember, we grieve physically. And so if you can give your body a 5-minute, break from all of this, that is really important. And it also builds a lot of great bonding time within the family. It can get kids off of tablets and off of phones. And we're going to walk 5 mailboxes tonight. Come on, everybody, leave your phones. We're going to do that. That your physical body needs that. When you move your body, endorphins are released, and we need those endorphins right now to help combat the fear and anxiety that we're receiving. I put look for moments of pleasure or schedule it, and I use that instead of happiness, because when you're grieving, happy is really annoying to grieving people. But peace or pleasure or just a moment of calm. For me, I know I really crave just moments of quiet. And so sometimes when I'm driving, I've gotten to the point where I'll turn the podcast off, I'll turn the music off, and just drive for 5 or 10 minutes in just silence. And that's a moment of pleasure for me. That's a moment of peace. That's a moment of just space. And that's really important for us as adults, but also important for children. They don't know that. They don't know how to really find that sometimes. Some of them do, but the ones who don't, kind of helping them have time to unplug can be really beneficial. And kind of like I was saying that at Idlewild, we kind of need to acknowledge that we're kind of in this pressure cooker of all of this loss and all of these feelings and everyone having very low capacity. We have to acknowledge that healing is slow. And I will tell you, 100% of the grieving people I work with hate when I remind them of that. When I've been grieving, I've hated reminding myself of that. We are a culture that wants immediacy and quick and fast, and grief is not like that. I think the pandemic has taught a lot of us that. In the beginning, we were all, we can do this together. And, you can probably look back over your own family or just our culture and see when people were getting the pandemic fatigue and all of those things. Healing is slow and grief is slow. And there's not a shot that we can get to take the grief away. And so we have to acknowledge that and sort of slow ourselves down. One thing I tell people a lot is there's no reward for speed. But if you go back to what I said in the beginning, there is reward for your grief if you grieve and you mourn, that outward expression. I'm not going to necessarily go through all of these, but I think it's very important that, again, people see various ways that we do respond to grief. And these are all for children as well. And I mainly put this slide up here to show you, again, that how complex grief is. That it's not just sad, and it's not just crying, and it's not just for 3 days, and then you're better. That there's a lot to it, and that we also all respond differently. If all of us who are on this call tonight, if we were siblings and we were grieving, our parent, we would all grieve differently because we're different people. And that's something that can be very frustrating within families. It can be something that's very frustrating for parents because your children may grieve very differently from you. And it's hard to sometimes recognize, oh, that's their grief, because that's not how I do it, I remember being frustrated with my brother when my dad was dying because he was not doing what I was doing. And I was like, what is wrong with you? And here I am, a grief counselor, right? But it's different when it's your own family. And it was kind of that moment of like, we are grieving totally in total different ways. And so I think it's important to understand that. I will just highlight explosive emotions because sometimes that scares people. Anger is real. Anger is an emotion and a feeling that God gave us, just like happiness. But again, the culture, the world that we live in, happy is good, anger is bad. And we give that message a lot. And that's one I would encourage you as parents to think about. How do you respond to when your child expresses anger? Now, don't get me wrong, it's not pleasant when they express anger, and we definitely want to make sure that they're staying safe and they're not going to hurt themselves or hurt, property or someone else. But it's important to be mindful of shaming responses about anger. This is where knowing your emotions is important. So acknowledging it. Whoa, you look really angry. I think you are getting so angry. Let's take a time out. Teach them again about modeling that behavior. Do you need to go outside and just throw the basketball? Why don't you go do that for 5 minutes? And then we'll come back to this conversation. So again, you acknowledge the feeling. Again, remember their frontal lobe. Sometimes they can't always acknowledge that. Help them with a coping skill of a timeout. But then when you come back to them, let's talk about that. Whoa, you were mad. That's not a shameful message. That's not giving shame. When you add shame to them is like, you are out of control and you better never do that again. I don't ever want to see that behavior again. Those types of sentences. That brings shame with it. Again, they're probably already feeling really bad and not really fully understanding what's happening to them, because with grief becomes this new intensity of feelings maybe they've never had before. So again, we don't want to just let them get away with whatever they want, right? And we need to make sure they're safe. But acknowledging what the feeling is, helping them find a coping skill, and then revisiting what got them there is really important. Okay. Oh, let me also acknowledge relief, especially with the death of a loved one. Sometimes there can be relief. Okay. I always say, not everyone that dies was a wonderful, great person. So some people, it's home can be a little easier. Or if it was a death related to an illness, that could have brought a lot of really hard things. I'm not glad the person died, but I'm glad that they don't suffer anymore. These are the common things that we hear from children. And children are oftentimes afraid to verbalize those relief feelings because they think they're wrong or bad, or it's going to get translated that they're not sad that their loved one died. Because again, kids get messages and they know when we're grieving, okay, we're supposed to be sad. And then, if I express any type of relief, they kind of put their own shame on them, if that makes sense. So just know that relief is a normal response to loss. You all may be doing this too. A lot of people talking about the pandemic, talking about, well, what are some things that have come from this that haven't been so bad? What are some things that have come that have really kind of been good for our family or have taught us, new and different things? And that's kind of what the relief means right there in terms of the pandemic. Parents, I want to give you something. I want you to remember this. You don't have to have all the answers. Okay? You do not have to have all the answers. So kids are really good at asking why questions. And I just want you to know that one thing that you can say is, I don't know. That's a really great question. I don't know. That's not going to ignite that like safety, that fear response I was talking about, because you're being honest with them. You say, that's a really great question. I don't know. Let's figure out maybe somebody we could ask Let's figure out what we can do to maybe find the answer to that. Number one, parents, that buys you time, right? But that's an honest way to answer that, instead of either making up something or doing what a lot of people will do is, oh, you don't need to worry about that. That's nothing you ever need to worry about. Our kids have learned a lot this year that they need to worry about. A global pandemic, racial problems everywhere on the TV all the time. They don't have to look far beyond Idlewild to experience loss of people that they love, people that they see. You can't have all the answers. I don't have all the answers. We have to work on those together. So please just know that that is something that you can walk away with, knowing that it's okay to tell them that. I don't know, but that's a great question. Let's figure out, let's write that down so we don't forget it. And let's think about maybe people that we can ask and see what they think. Or let's read about it. Let's find some books that maybe can help us with that. That's again teaching your children how to mourn. Remember, mourning is the verbs, the action. So being honest, I don't know. That's something I struggle with too. Let's write it down and let's see if we can find some folks who can help us. Grief burst. A grief burst is kind of like that wave in the ocean I was telling you about that kind of comes out of the clear blue. But grief bursts, they happen as long as there are waves in the ocean. Meaning, grief bursts you may see 2 and 3 years after a loss, or with children throughout developmental stages of their lives. Now, here's a big, big, big myth that I have to clear up. Grief is, I said that ocean, it's with us forever. There's no ending point. But it does not mean that a child who is grieving is going to grow up and live a maladjusted life. Okay, that is a myth. If we teach children about grief, if we help them understand how to express emotions, if we help them learn healthy coping skills, if we help them know that we as their parents and as adults, we are trusted and we will be honest with them and we will tell them the truth even about really hard things, they will have the skills that they need and they will not set them up for a future of maladjusted behaviors. Okay. So that's why, again, coming back to you all as parents, that modeling that behavior, modeling grief, modeling feeling discussions is so important. Grief overload, I can't stress enough. That's what we're all experiencing right now. And I'm so grateful that you all asked me to be with you tonight just to talk about grief for a little bit, even though it is heavy, because grief overload is something that is very universal right now. Everyone is experiencing that. You can see the other things that I have there on the slide, you know, kind of acknowledging that grief is an expression of love. You know, if we love, we grieve. Striving to grow with your grief, that's not something I usually say to people who are fresh in grief, because the response is, I don't want to grow. I was fine how I was. But we know through our work, we have a focus on reconciling grief. We don't believe in getting over grief, moving on, having closure. We believe in reconciling that grief into our lives now, but also into the future. So that's a lot of heaviness, but grief can heal. I've been doing this work for 23 years now. I wouldn't be able to do it if I didn't see healing happen. Now, again, I don't see closure because I don't look for closure. I look for reconciling. And how does that happen? How do we heal our grief? That's through these things here that we've been talking about. So even with the pandemic, we will heal. It's going to take time. We're going to heal in stages. You know, kind of, we all, I was talking with Frank, my husband, the other day, and I said, do you remember, you know, I think it was like last February, we were watching the news and watching people in other countries wear masks. And I honestly said, I cannot imagine ever having to live like that. And I remember Frank looked at me almost like he knew it was coming and I didn't. And maybe I was in denial that it was coming, right? But knowing and expressing over these last few months with the like, I can't believe we're still wearing these masks. I can't believe we're wearing them. I know we need them, but I cannot believe this is our reality. So expressing that helps us heal. Self-care, taking care of yourself. Again, parents, I will come back to it. You cannot take care of your little people if you do not take care of yourself. People think that self-care is selfish or they don't have time for it. You have to. You cannot keep going on an empty tank. It will not only hurt you, it will hurt your children. So finding moments of self-care is critical. Remembering, memorializing, talking about those who have died, talking about those secondary losses that come from the pandemic, understanding that you're going to continue to regrieve. You're going to feel fine one day, and the next day you are going to be so angry. Today, I was angry at COVID. My little cousin, who's a little miracle baby in our family, is turning 3 tomorrow. And I was angry that we had to just drop off his gift and wave from the front porch. And that was this moment of re-grieving. And to know that you're going to have that as parents, but your children are too. And you're going to think, what is going on? Like, why are you being so angry about wearing a mask or going to school or virtual school? But that's grieving. That's a grief burst. It's protesting. I do not like this. I do not want this. This does not feel good to me. So knowing that that is going to happen. And then finding hope where you can. Finding hope in the little moments. Finding hope through each other at Idlewild and through the ways that Idlewild has allowed us to stay connected during these times. That's very important. Then I just have some resources on here. These are just some of our favorite things for parents. Some websites, a podcast, and then definitely some of my very, very favorite books. So Siblings Without Rivalry is amazing. And then How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and Listen So Kids Will Talk. And the same for teens. Those are just excellent, excellent resources that I wanted you all to have. So I can talk forever. You probably have figured that out, but do you all have any questions specific to your family or kind of what you're experiencing?
Angela, I confess, as I was listening to you talk, it struck me that I've never, and I think this is true for Jenna too, we've never experienced the loss of someone in our immediate family, right? We've had grandparents pass away, we've had other loved ones pass away, but never someone in our immediate family. But understanding just the experience of living through pandemic as a form of grief, and realizing just that it really is a marathon. It's something that hits you in waves. It's, I feel some empathy, I guess, toward someone who does have that acute experience of immediate family grief. But it also, something struck me that when you said that, a child who has experienced this acute grief is not, destined to be maladjusted later in life. We're about to have 2 pastors who experienced that very young in their lives. Sarah lost her mother when she was very young. David lost his mother when he was very young. And it just kind of struck me that I wonder if those experiences really will help them guide us out of this space as a church we've been in. Not just with our acute experiences of grief, but, as we've come out of this pandemic as well.
That's a really great point. And I love that you said that, because being very mindful of the time, I couldn't say everything that I obviously would love to say, but resilience. So what you just described, in Sarah and David is resilience. And grieving children are very resilient. I could not have stayed in this field this long working with grieving children if I did not see that. And so a couple of us at work have talked about some of our kids, they grow up on us, and we have all these kids kind of in college and in graduate school. And a lot of the kids who've gone through our program have found their way into helping professions. Their grief, that is part of childhood grief. It can be kind of seen in their vocational choices because of how resilience works and how their brain has been formatted and the things that they have learned. And I think those are huge strengths that they both have. And I think you're right, because they are resilient people. They will lead in a very resilient way. I feel very confident.
Angela, I had a question. Do you have any suggestions for books for children, especially like the elementary age kids, that you might be able to offer?
Yes, I can send, I can email kind of a list out. One that's probably my favorite is called Badger's Parting Gifts, but I can email this and so that you all can have all this. Badger's is a little bit long, but it is a beautiful book about invisible gifts. And Badger dies and his friends are grieving him, but they think back on the invisible gifts that Badger gave them. There's a great book called Mean Soup. It's not necessarily about grief, but it's about anger and expression. So that's another. So yes, I've got a lot of The Rabbit Listened is another one of my favorites. So I'll get that list out to you all.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you for doing this tonight. I know it's late.
Well, that's okay. Good to see you. I've missed y'all.
I know it's good to see all of you guys.
So if you have questions, I definitely want you to ask, but I also told you that how heavy this was, and I wanted to acknowledge that. And I think before we get off and you kind of transition to all the other millions of things I know that you all have to do on a Sunday night before Monday, back to work and school and all that stuff, is taking some really deep breaths. You may be feeling this in your shoulders and just kind of in your stomachs even. This is heavy stuff to talk about. And so you really need to acknowledge that, when we get off, you need to say, whoo, that was heavy, or that hit me, and acknowledge that, because you're carrying this right now. We all are. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Angela.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
It's been really, really helpful and very relevant. Thank you.
Yes.
Angela, feel free, if you like, just to send that list of books on to Jenna. And I think you can share it out to the class. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll get y'all a list for different age groups and then adults as well. And feel free to share it wherever.
Thank you so much.
Well, it was great to see everybody.
Yeah.
We are going to sign off.
Right. Thanks, everyone.
Good night.